Speaking of like these neural connections in our brain and how we form all these different synapses and thoughts and behaviors that become so difficult to break because your brain is meant to, like you said, remember these things. You talk about this idea of migration theory. So I kind of wanted to get your take on what exactly migration theory is.
Like I said, I did not fit the bill of what even I thought a stereotypical person with an eating disorder was. I thought a person with an eating disorder is somebody that just wanted to be skinny and was really vain. And, that's what I thought at 16 an eating disorder was. And then it happened to me, and I didn't really understand that I had an eating disorder until I was about 25. And when I did sort of realize, like, I've got an eating disorder, I was like, God, I'm not one of those people. Like I was a tomboy as a girl. That couldn't possibly be me. And so then I was just sort of interested by it. And I knew that within myself that my eating disorder was nothing to do with wanting to be thin. It really wasn't. I didn't even like being thin. And so I just started to ask, like, why could this be? Why could this be? And then what my eating disorder was massively characterized by was this horrific exercise compulsion. And when I was 16, like, you would not catch me dead in a gym. I remember once, like, we were actually taken to the college gym, like, you have to do an induction. And I was one of the girls that sat there. I was like, there's no way in hell I'm doing any of this. Like, you wouldn't have caught me dead in a gym. But then as my eating disorder progressed, quite quickly, I was absolutely obsessed with the gym. It was my life. I spent all of my time moving, and my exercise compulsion moved from being about the gym to just being about moving the whole time, to the point where I couldn't sit down between the hours that I woke up and the hours that I went to bed. And that really, for me, all of that movement compulsion was almost far bigger than the restriction for me. And nobody talked about exercise compulsion, movement compulsion in eating disorders. When I was in recovery, nobody talked about that. None of my doctors picked up on it. Nobody knew it was a thing. And so, but I started to really see, like, this is a huge part of my problem. It's not just food restriction. The movement is just as big. In fact, the movement might even be bigger for me. Like, I can get over and eat more food, but I couldn't stop the movement. Yeah. And so I started to really think about that. And then it sort of clicked with me when I started to, like, look at sort of what happens, because the whole energy deficits thing, when I started to understand energy deficit, I looked at animal models for energy deficit, and then I just stumbled across something about animal migration. And as I read about animal migration, I was like, oh my God, that was me, this compulsive desire to move. And so if you think about, like, animal migration for a moment, which I guess I hadn't done properly, it's not like I'd thought about that very much. But then when I thought about it, it's like, it's not like the bird, say you've got a bird in England. It's not like that bird just sits there one day and says to its other birds, you know what, should we just fly to Australia? Might be nicer over there. Like, it's not like they actually consciously make that decision. And so if you look into sort of animal migration, what it talks about is the birds, or whatever the migrating animal is, what starts to happen is the food in their environment gets less, and they go into energy deficit. And then at some point, they've gone into energy deficit enough that something clicks in their brain that just gives them the impulse to get up in the air and fly a heck of a long way. And the other thing that really interested me about learning about that was that when animals need to migrate, certain parts of their brain that deal with being tired shut down, because it's not like, say if a bird is flying across the ocean, it can't just like be like, oh, my wing's tired, I need to stop, it would die. So it can't get tired. That sort of part of the brain gets shut down a bit. But the most interesting part to me was that for an animal to migrate, the brain actually has to disincentivize feeding behavior, because the bird can't stop to eat. First of all, because there's very likely not very much food around the ocean. So where is it going to stop to eat? It just has to fly its ass off as quickly as it can to get across the ocean before it dies of energy deficit. And so that part about the section of the animal's brain that's migrating that disincentivizes feeding, that really interested me. And it's true of not just birds, but all animal species that migrate. If an elephant has to walk a heck of a long way, it can't be stopping it to eat or try and find food. So if you're in an area of scarce resources, you've got the decision to stay there and look for food, or migrate, move your ass, get out of there. Now, if that if that animal's brain is saying, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, you've got to look for food, they're going to stay and try and look for food. There's no food in the environment, they're going to die. But the ones that said, not hungry, don't even want to eat, eating's bad, we need to move, those were the ones that would have moved out of that environment, got to the environment of abundant food, and they would have survived. And so I'm reading about animal migration, and I'm just like, it just kind of hit me. I was like, oh my God, this was me. This was me. I just compulsively moved. And it wasn't that I ever didn't like eating or I didn't have an appetite. I just felt that I couldn't. I felt that that was the wrong thing to do. And so it just, to me, the more I read about animal migration, I was like, I was totally migrating. That's what was happening. I had such a movement compulsion. I just wanted to move the whole time. If I didn't move, I'd feel huge anxiety. Think of that from a migration point of view. The animal has to move. It can't be happy just lying around. Otherwise, all it's going to do is lie around. You know, the brain has to prioritize migration and then use emotion to make the animal want to do that thing, feel like the animal wants to migrate. And then, so I was like, oh my gosh, this is radical. And then I came across Shan Geisinger, who had already written up this theory. She'd already written up the theory that I'd kind of come to the conclusion to. So I, of course, contacted her immediately. I'm like, you're a genius. And Shan hadn't had an eating disorder herself, but she was a therapist that worked with lots of people with eating disorders. And she was taught the old-fashioned, like, therapy way, therapize people with eating disorders until they stop having the eating disorder. But she was just like, you know what, it's not working. So she started to look into other things. So then she wrote, like, years ago, this paper about how actually anorexia is a migration response. And it was kind of slated because I guess none of the therapists really liked it. She couldn't get it off the ground, you know, because that would mean that the whole field of treatment of eating disorders would have to put the brakes on and take a biological approach and start throwing food at people rather than therapizing them. Because the other thing that's true of animal migration is that it's a feast, follow, famine thing. When the bird gets to the land of abundant food, it stuffs its face. The bird doesn't sit there and go, well, somebody should put me on a meal plan and make me eat like 3 times a day, and I should definitely not eat too much. The bird just shoves the food in its face. And that eating, that feast, is one of the things that signals to the bird's brain that the migration is over. It's the huge intake of food, the feast that follows the famine, that signals, all right, we don't need to migrate anymore. Let's turn off the desire to move, and let's turn off the desire to not eat very much, and all of those things. And so the other thing that also happened with me when I did cold turkey, my compulsive movement, and I did all my eating disorder and my cold turkey and all that before I learned about migration theory. I just knew deep down it's what I had to do. And so I went cold turkey on the movement. And then about 5 days later, I just suddenly felt like I had been hit by a bus. I was exhausted. I couldn't hardly get off the couch. I was that tired. And of course, my eating disorder brain was like, see, this is what happens. You've become lazy. And then afterwards, when I'm looking at migration theory and things like that, and I'm reading about how parts of the brain that deal with tiredness and parts of the brain that deal with achiness and that feedback from the body that's saying, hey, human, you've been doing a lot, you should rest, how those are turned off. I realized that was the reason that I could run no matter how much my legs were hurting, and I would run with injuries. I'd work out with all these injuries, and I'd done that for years. And then because I'd stopped and my brain had started to go, okay, well, maybe we don't need to migrate anymore. Maybe we can let this human know how tired she is. And it was like, boom, I was so tired. And that happens to a lot of people in recovery when they finally totally stop the compulsive movement. I'm not talking just stopping going to the gym. I'm not talking just stopping running. I'm talking totally letting yourself rest. It's like, for most people, it's between 5 to 14 days and they suddenly feel like they've been hit by a truck and they're exhausted. And that's because that part of the brain has gone like, oh, we can let you know how tired you are now because you're resting, because you're not migrating anymore. And so all of this stuff just really made sense to me based on my experience. It wasn't like I was sitting there from necessarily an intellectual level. I was like, that's what happened to me. I couldn't feel pain the way I sort of knew I was supposed to feel pain when I had an eating disorder and I was running every day. And I absolutely prioritized movement over everything else, everything. There was nothing that came before me going for a run. Hell or high water, I was going for a run. So for my brain to put exercising so high on my list of decision things to do, and our brains kind of like need to prioritize survival. My brain was obviously thinking that movement was part of my ability to survive. And why would it do that otherwise, thinking that it needed to migrate? And of course, it thought it needed to migrate because I hadn't been eating enough food. So that's energy deficit for you. And I believe that because humans, for the human race to be where it is now, with like refrigerators and stuff like that and farming, think of how many thousands of years that we had to survive as hunter-gatherers. Famine would have been the biggest threat to humans, bigger than anything else. Famine would have been what killed the most humans. And so our brains would have had to prioritize a response to famine. Like if we went into energy deficit, if our brains got the message that there was not enough food in the environment, because nobody was going into energy deficit in those days because they were dieting or it was fashionable. Mm-hmm. The only reason you go into energy deficit is because there is not enough food. And so our brains have to have a genetically coded response to energy deficit. They have to, for us to have genetically got this far. Otherwise, we would have all died of famine. If every time a famine came, we were like, oh, well, let's just sit around and see what happens, we would have all died. Now, I also think that in the same way that some animals, like different breeds, different species of animals have different responses to famine. Some animals hibernate, some animals migrate. Some animals do a combination of both. Like there's all these different versions. And those versions would have evolved because in that animal's environment, the habitat it was in, the place on the earth it was in, the time it was in, that would have been the one that made the most of them survived. So the bear typically hibernates, due to the bear's body type, probably due to its habitat. There's probably 1,000 different reasons why hibernation ultimately ended up being the best choice for a bear when it comes to energy deficit. And hibernation is basically throwing the metabolism down to almost nothing as low as it can go and storing fat and waiting it out. Now, some people right now, that is their body's response to energy deficit. And I believe that that is also the reason why in some people's bodies, when they start to diet, they don't want to migrate like I did. They actually just go super low energy and they actually gain weight. It's because their body's having a hibernation response. And I think that until the diet industry can understand that our bodies are so much smarter when it comes to famine and had to evolve through so much to get us to where we are today, that it's not going to be as simple as going on a diet and picking what weight you want to be, that the body's going to have an opinion about that, and the body is going to have a deep-rooted response to that, then the diet industry will continue to make people less healthy than they actually started off.